Welcome back, United States history students, to another video lecture series on the Roaring Twenties. And today we're going to look at the Harlem Renaissance, and we'll look at it through the art and especially the poetry of the time period. Now, to help set the context for this, I'd like us to take a look at a video from one of Hollywood's most popular entertainers. His name is Al Jolson. You look at this and tell me what's wrong with it.
Mammy, the sun shines east, the sun shines west, but I know where the sun shines best.
All right, so the problem with that, of course, is that Al Jolson is a white guy, and he is wearing blackface. So many, especially white Americans that were racist, and Northern Americans as well that were racist, couldn't handle black performers on stage throughout the 19th century, but even in the 1920s, many of them did not like black musicians playing jazz. So they would prefer white guys that would either dress in blackface and do it, or they would take African-American songs and a white guy would perform them as a more acceptable version of jazz. Now that is starting to change, though, because Stepin Fetchit is going to become the first African-American to be cast in a Hollywood film. Before that, all Hollywood films were cast with blackface actors. Then we also have Hattie McDaniel, who's going to star in Gone with the Wind, and she will be the first African-American to be cast as a female role in a Hollywood film, but she will also be the first to ever be nominated and win an Academy Award. So go for it, Hattie McDaniel, making history, right? Now here's another little video about the changes happening in the Harlem Renaissance.
For many, the 1920s evokes images of flappers and speakeasies. But for one group of Americans, the decade was also one of rebirth. It was known as the Harlem Renaissance. For the first time, African-American writers, artists, and musicians won renown for their contributions to world culture. Their goal? To find outlets for group expression and self-determination as a means of achieving equality and civil rights. When World War I broke out, American factories experienced a shortage of workers. Many Black Americans living in the South saw this as their chance for a better life. They migrated in droves to northern cities, such as Chicago, Detroit, and New York. The New York City neighborhood of Harlem, in particular, attracted a large number of African-American artists and intellectuals. It wasn't long before Harlem became the epicenter of an artistic explosion. Works produced during the Harlem Renaissance appealed not just to blacks, but crossed over to white audiences as well. The musical Shuffle Along, written by and starring African Americans, became a smash hit on Broadway.
I'm just wild about Harry, and Harry's wild about me.
Langston Hughes was among the period's most famous writers. Known for his folksy humor, he was nicknamed the O. Henry of Harlem. Other writers included Countee Cullen, James Weldon Johnson, and Zora Neale Hurston. Great artists also emerged on the Harlem scene, such as Aaron Douglas and Augusta Savage, who opened her own studio and taught sculpture to other African Americans. And then there were jazz legends, among them Duke Ellington, Bessie Smith, and Cab Calloway. After the stock market crashed in 1929, the country fell into the Great Depression, and the Harlem Renaissance began to fade. But by then, the movement had already forged a path for future generations and ushered in a new era in American culture and politics.
So what we see with the Harlem Renaissance is that there's tremendous change that's taking place here in the as a result of the Great Migration. The Great Migration was something where we started to see a lot more African Americans in the North, and so because of that, because 3 times as many African Americans were in the North now than used to be, there's going to be a growth of political influence because now they're suddenly having the opportunity to vote, although sometimes still that's difficult to be able to do. But there's a much greater freedom of expression that's happening at this time too. So one of those spirits of protest that we see, or one of the voices of the Harlem Renaissance that we see, is Claude McKay. And we're going to read a couple of poems by Claude McKay. So I provided you with a link to be able to give you the voices of protest from the Harlem Renaissance, but while we are reading, go ahead and follow along. This poem by Claude McKay is called To the White Fiends. Now, something for you to consider is, first of all, the word fiend is a word that means a villain, someone that you don't like. There's someone who is a bigot, who's malicious, you name it. So he is writing to those bigoted villains. Think you I am not fiend and savage too? Think you I could not arm me with a gun and shoot down 10 of you for every one of my black brothers murdered, burnt by you? Be not deceived. For every deed you do, I could match, outmatch. Am I not Africa's son? Black of that black land where black deeds are done. But the Almighty from the darkness drew my soul and said, even thou shaft be a light, a while to burn on the benighted earth. Thy dusky face I set among the white, for thee to prove thyself of highest worth, before the world is swallowed up in night, to show thy little lamp. Go forth, go forth. I gotta say, I love this poem because I feel like Claude McKay is giving us almost like modern rap lyrics, okay? He sounds to me like the Kendrick Lamar of the 1920s, if you will. In that first stanza, you can see him saying, like, you think that I can't do this too? You think I can't just pull a gun on you and cap you in the face? I'm from Africa, brother. I'm from Africa. I could do dark deeds to you. But then the second stanza tells us that he's not going to, because he knows that his purpose is something more, that God set his dusky face, his African-American face amongst the white, to send a message to them, to show them what it means to be a civilized and good human being, to let his light shine. You see, this is the essence of the Harlem Renaissance, and it's taking place in Harlem because Harlem was a very cosmopolitan area where there was a lot of African Americans that had moved up there during the World War I era in order to seek jobs and, release from the South. And then also it's a renaissance because it means rebirth. It is changing, and culture is changing thanks to these African American voices. Now, the definition for this is that it is a rediscovery of black folk culture. What black folk culture means is that it is heralding back to their slave era days in which they're looking at slave songs and remembering their past, but at the same time it's an emancipation from genteel tradition. Genteel tradition is a reference to Southern tradition, Southern white tradition. And one of the greatest voices of the Harlem Renaissance is Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes gives us some incredible poetry. I'm going to let him read this next one to you. It's called The Weary Blues.
Droning a drowsy, syncopated tune, rocking back and forth to a mellow croon, I heard a Negro play. Down on Lenox Avenue the other night, by the pale, dull pallor of an old gas light, he did a lazy sway, he did a lazy sway, to the tune of those weary blues. With his ebony hands on each ivory key, he made that poor piano moan with melody. Oh, blues! Swaying to and fro on his rickety stool, he played that sad, raggy tune like a musical fool. Sweet blues, coming from a black man's soul. Oh, blues. In a deep song voice with a melancholy tone, I heard that Negro sing, that old piano moan. Ain't got nobody in all this world, ain't got nobody but myself. I was gwine to quit my frowning and put my troubles on the shelf. Thump, thump, thump went his foot on the floor. He played a few chords, then he sang some more. I got the weary blues and I can't be satisfied. Got the weary blues and can't be satisfied. I ain't happy no more, and I wish that I had died. Far into the night he crooned that tune. The stars went out, and so did the moon. The singer stopped playing and went to bed, while the weary blues echoed through his head. He slept like a rock, or a man that's dead.
Oh, what a beautiful poem. I mean, if you just put yourself into that moment of being like in a dark, dingy club and there's one man on stage playing on the piano and he's putting everything he's got into that moment. It's something moving and inspiring, isn't it? So it's important for us to look at our narrator here who is watching this African-American man put everything he's got into this song, and from watching that man's pain on stage playing the piano, our narrator is experiencing something deep and emotional and spiritual. And that is the essence of catharsis. It is something in poetry where or in life, where by seeing someone else's pain, you experience an emotional purge as well. So a really cool thing that Langston Hughes does for us there. Now we have some other Langston Hughes poetry as well that we'll read now, and I will read to you. So go ahead and follow along in our little handout that we've got. The first one is The South. The lazy, laughing South with blood on its mouth. The sunny-faced South. Beast strong, idiot-brained, the child-minded South, scratching in the dead fire's ashes for a Negro's bones. Cotton and the moon, warmth, earth, warmth, the sky, the sun, the stars, the magnolia-scented South, beautiful like a woman, seductive as a dark-eyed whore, passionate, cruel, honey-lipped, syphilitic. That is the South. And I, who am black, would love her, but she spits in my face. And I, who am black, would give her many rare gifts, but she turns her back upon me. So now I seek the North, the cold-faced North, for she, they say, is a kinder mistress, and in her house my children may escape the spell of the South. A couple of things that I think we should look at here. First of all, with the description of the South in the first stanza is pretty powerful, because he's calling the South beast-strong, idiot-brained, child-minded, and then this reference to scratching in the dead fire's ashes for a Negro's bones is a reference, of course, to slavery and the cotton picking that was taking place in the South, like Cotton and the Moon. And then magnolia is something that is referencing the Deep South, because magnolia are a big part of the Deep South's culture. It's describing the South as beautiful, dark-eyed, a whore, a syphilitic whore. That is what the South is. And yet, for some reason, he loves her. I mean, if you take a look at the second stanza, I, who am black, would love her, but she spits in my face. And then I could give her many rare gifts, like my art, but she turns away. And so then he talks about turning to the north, and this, of course, is a reference to the Great Migration, having to take his art to the north instead, because she, they say, is a kinder mistress. Now, when you think of a mistress, that's not your wife. That's not your home. That is not where you belong. And there in the arms of the North, he thinks that maybe he and his children can escape the spell of the South. Wow, that's beautiful. All right, let's take a look at another one. This is called Poet to Bigot, and a bigot is someone who is a racist. I have done so little for you, and you have done so little for me, that we have good reason never to agree. I, however, have such meager power, clutching at a moment, while you control an hour. But your hour is a stone. My moment is a flower. Beautiful. All right, as you take a look at the issue of the struggle between power here, the bigot has all the power of politics and money and jobs and you name it, whereas the poet has really no power. It's meager, where the poet is like clutching at that one little moment, that moment being this poem that you just read with me. I mean, the fact that we are reading this poem now just shows us the eternal nature of this thing, the life that is part of it, because those bigots that were in control of the hour, right, they had the power at that time, their hour was a stone, lifeless, has no meaning, whereas his moment, the poet's moment, is a flower which grows. It might have a short life, might have only lasted these few seconds in which we're reading it together, but it's beautiful. Let's take a look at I Too. Now, I Too, of course, is a very famous poem. You maybe have heard it before, and it's also the inspiration for the research paper topic that we're going to be working on. So I'll read this to you, and then let's see what you think. I Too by Langston Hughes. I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes. But I laugh, and I eat well, and grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am, and be ashamed. Oh, that is the essence of the Harlem Renaissance for you right there. We also can see this reflected in art. If you take a look at the art here from an artist of the Harlem Renaissance named Aaron Douglas, he's giving us the Song of the Towers, and here is kind of an encapsulation of African American history in one piece of art. Here we have an African American man who is being subdued by a malicious hand, and notice it's a white hand, and it's a black man who's being subdued. He's also ensnared in these white, what appear to be maybe chains, and so this of course is a reference to slavery. So this is part one of African American history in America. And then here we have a man who is black who is crawling up a widget. Now a widget is the building block of industrial society, so he's climbing up a widget. He's carrying a suitcase with him as malicious white hands are coming after him. What do you think this is a reference to? The Great Migration, part two of African American history. And then here we see the towers. We see the towers that are existing in New York City. We see the Statue of Liberty. We see the light that is shooting out of this epicenter of, or the center of this universe of culture. And standing in the middle is a black man with a saxophone, showing us the glories of jazz. And so as we take a look now at the politics of the time period, a lot of things are happening that are changing with African American representation in the North. There's a little thing called Negro nationalism, and this is going to turn into a much bigger thing later. Negro nationalism is going to be the forerunner or the predecessor to Black Power. The Black Power movement of the 1960s takes a lot of their inspiration from Negro nationalism, which says that it's going to exalt blackness, black cultural expression, and black exclusiveness. Negro nationalism basically says that African Americans should have their own country. They should be their own people. They should exist in their own businesses. They should not support white businesses. They should not ask for handouts from an American government. Instead, they should have their own government and do their own thing, because otherwise they are merely supplicants to the pseudo-slavery that they see happening around America. It's a pretty bold assertion, right? And one of the guys that's the leader of this movement is a guy named Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey, you can see here, is wearing a uniform because he wants to start his own little black military unit. And, it's a black uniform, by the way, in case you were wondering. And so Marcus Garvey is trying to take an idea that repatriationists of the 19th century had already advocated for, in which Liberia would be used as a new colony for African Americans who are going to move back to Africa. So what he did is he started the United Negro Improvement Association, and they are going to take a bunch of money to help them get back to Africa. He wanted to leave because he thought that every white person was a potential Klansman. And if you look at the number of lynchings that were taking place before this and the race riots of the early 1919 and 1920, I mean, it makes sense, kind of, right? Plus, another fun fact, if you will, is that there were actually two presidents in American history who were card-carrying members of the KKK. I don't know if they kept their robes in the closet or not, but two card-carrying members of the KKK were Warren G. Harding and then Calvin Coolidge, both Klansmen, which is ironic because Calvin Coolidge is actually going to forgive Marcus Garvey for a federal offense. You see, Marcus Garvey will go to jail because he's going to be found guilty of money extortion. It's a good chance that maybe the FBI was trying to set him up here, but either way, he gets caught, and then the president is going to give him a presidential pardon that allows him to leave jail and then go to Jamaica in exile. Now, another group at this time is the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It was started in response to a race riot that took place in 1910, and they felt that the best way to combat bigotry was to educate the people. One of their co-founders and forerunners of this movement was W.E.B. Du Bois, and he, remember, had a doctorate in sociology from Harvard. He's the first African-American to do that, and then he originally came up with this idea for the NAACP and also his other movement, the Niagara Movement, because they were in New York with a group of African-American men who wanted to meet together to talk about how do we deal with these race riots and these problems that we see in America. And they were not allowed allowed to sit at the table in the restaurant in New York where they had gone. And so what they did is they went across the Niagara River, across Niagara Falls River, and they went into Canada. They sat down and they formulated this idea of the Niagara movement and the NAACP, which was going to try and get African American politicians and leaders into America that would help to change this terrible situation of racism that they saw. And a good example of that you can see here.
The divide separating black and white widens. Ghettos expand. Harlem in New York. Paradise Valley in Detroit. The Hill District in Pittsburgh. In Chicago, the South Side. Separate, but not equal. Black Americans are on the outside looking in. But black neighborhoods also mean black majorities. And in America, majority means power. In 1928, voters on Chicago's South Side elect Oscar DePriest, the first black congressman in the North. 80 years later, another Chicago resident becomes the nation's first black president.
So how cool is that, right? The first African American from the North that's elected to Congress, and it's important that we differentiate the two because Southern African Americans had been elected in 1866 through 1870 in the South, but the first African American to be elected from the North to Congress is Oscar DePriest. He's from the same neighborhood that Barack Obama was from, where in 2008, of course, he is going to run for president and be the first African American president. So the long-lasting effects of the Harlem Renaissance still being felt today. There's still a lot of issues today, of course, but certainly one of the lasting and beautiful impacts of the 1920s.